Hey there, this is Cindy, and I'm so glad you're here, and I can't wait for today's episode. But just before we dive in, I wanted to share with you a few ways we can work together if you happen to be looking to up-level your negotiation skills. I've got a range of programs available from online to group to my signature one-on-one mastermind or VIP experiences, and all are designed to help you better leverage your innate or natural power to get more of what you want and deserve as you negotiate your best life. So check out our website at artoffemininenegotiation.com if that's something that sounds interesting to you. And now on to today's program. I am happy to reintroduce you to Debra Roberts. Those of you who are lucky enough to catch it, last week we started talking with Debra about how to become a better negotiator through the art of communication. And Debra had so much valuable information to share that I just had to get her back for a round 2 follow-up. So welcome, Debra. It's great to have you here again.
Thank you. It's so good to be here with you again.
And for those who missed last week, definitely encourage you to go check out that podcast episode. Debra was dropping all kinds of golden gems for us about her relationship protocol. And for those of you who don't know Debra Roberts is a conversation expert and creator of the relationship protocol communications model. And her approach really does revolutionize communications, both personally and professionally. I always talk about from the boardroom to the bedroom. I love that Debra talks about from the boardroom to the kitchen table, which is probably more politically appropriate. And with a background as a certified trauma consultant and a licensed clinical social worker, Debra's got years and a wide range of experience extending to all types of challenging relationships in home and in the workplace. So Debra, last time we were together, you shared a bit about your signature communication models and the benefits of improved communication. So today I thought maybe we could go a little deeper further, and let's start with what are some of the key problems that you find in your business with communications in the workplace?
Well, I think in general, most people don't know how to initiate conversations. So either they don't have them and they avoid them, or, right, that's common
So true.
everywhere because it seems easier. If I'm not sure what to say or I don't know what the outcome's going to be, I might as well avoid it. But the other thing is I don't really think it through and I just start talking.
Yeah.
And without any regard for what I'm actually saying, how I'm coming across, or how it might be being received. So I would say those are the two most common, and they happen all the time. I think in life, people, if they don't know what to say, they either don't say anything or they don't quite say it in an effective way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I think you're right. That's in life, and it really can get exacerbated in the workplace. And how much of that, as you were talking about that avoiding sort of personality type, how much do you think these problems are tied to those conflict resolution styles, you know, that avoiding versus competitive versus collaborative? What's your experience with that?
I think it's absolutely tied to your comfort level with what your personality style is, but your comfort level with what you perceive or what actually is confrontation. Sometimes we have a sense that something is going to be a confrontation, and in fact, it's just a conversation. And that's one of the things that I advise people when they're approaching a conversation and they fear a confrontation, is to look at it as simply a conversation. You're going to clarify something. How you approach it is not from a confrontational standpoint, and hopefully it won't be perceived that way. But some of it, a lot of times, is our personality type and the way that we view and understand confrontation.
Yeah, I love that you did two things. One, when we talk about that reframing, I'm a big fan of reframing how we look at negotiation, how we look at how we define conflict. But you also really touched on that perception piece. And boy, did we ever see a classic example of that. And I almost hate to bring it because it's just getting so much news attention. But, you know, the slap heard around the world at the Oscars recently. I mean, it's all about that perspective, right? There's no doubt Chris Rock intended the comment to be a joke, to be humorous, both to Will Smith and to Jada, and it certainly was not received that way. It's like, you know, that classic, if you put a number 6 on the floor and has set somebody at the top and the bottom, one person's going to see it as a 6, the other's going to see it as 9, and they're both right depending on their vantage point. What do you have to say about that perception problem or perspective taking in the workplace and beyond?
Well, are we talking about the slap, or are we
Well,
talking
either, Jen, I would say you could start with the slap or avoid it and take it in more broader real life application.
You know, for me, that was a classic case. If I'll touch on it for a moment, that was a classic case of someone who had a lot on his mind.
Yeah.
that had nothing to do with Chris Rock and everything to do with whatever trauma or struggle was going on for Will Smith. I have tremendous compassion for Will Smith for whatever he was going through, but his behavior really was unacceptable in that moment. It was impulsive. So that's what I would say about that. I saw that as sort of a trauma response more than anything.
Yeah.
And I do think Chris Rock handled himself amazingly.
Oh,
I don't know how I would be in that situation. I'd probably crumble and start crying.
yeah.
But that's the only thing I could think of.
Yeah, I thought he deserved major points for that. He was a total class act, and and it's a shame because I mean, there's so much negative press about it, but I think there are a lot of really valuable lessons to learn. I actually just did a blog post on it this week about the lessons we can learn, the negotiating lessons we can learn from that, because it's just taking that pause between every stimulus and response. You've got that pause where you get to choose how to react. And there are a number of options available. And why don't you speak to that a minute, whether in the context of that or just generally? If there's, a stimulus in the workplace, for example, where there's a misconnect, what are your recommendations for how to deal with that kind of potential conflict situation?
Well, interestingly, and I'm sure you won't be surprised, you and I are again using similar language. I call it hitting the pause button.
Yeah.
So similar to your commentary here, I always recommend before you respond, especially if you're going to get defensive or aggressive or something negative, if you have a negative reaction to something that's going on, hitting that pause button, stopping the action and making a decision, even if the decision is to say, I don't know what to do. Yeah. I don't know what to say, or I'm very upset. And this is information you're saying to yourself.
Yeah.
If you want to say something out loud, you can say, I'm not sure how to respond. I need to think about my answer. Yeah. Or take a moment, excuse yourself, go for a walk, go to the restroom, do something that gives you an opportunity to break up that moment so that you do have a chance to think through what you might want to say and a response that you can feel reasonably good about, rather than thinking later, oh, crap, I shouldn't have said something in the moment. I also think that a little tip that I will often say is, if you're going to get defensive and you can feel it coming, ask a question.
Yes.
If I ask you a question, it gives me time to think about my response. And also I'm asking for clarification. What did you mean by that? Yeah. Can you explain? Help me understand what you're talking about. When I do that, I may get more information that will then enlighten me to realize I don't have to get defensive. Perhaps you didn't mean it the way that I was interpreting it. But also, most importantly, it's that pause to take a breath, catch your breath, and think, how do I want to respond? Because once you get defensive, the conversation ends. It's about, now you've gotten defensive, and now we have a different topic, a different twist.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the conversation ends or spirals sideways into a very different conversation, a very non-productive. That's right. Well, and I love, there's a lot there as always with your answers, and thank you for that. So a couple of things I want to just really put a pin in for our listeners there. And one is this idea, I call it our internal negotiation. And so I really would love your insights on that, putting a pin again on just generally, whether in a conflict where you're about to be defensive, but what role, if any, do you think that sort of internal dialogue or that negotiation with ourselves plays in any communication?
I think in general, we can only control ourselves. And at the end of the day, we have to be our best friend.
Yeah.
So it's my inner talk, my self-talk, that is either going to support me, even if it's giving myself a hard time. Sometimes that can be motivating. But in general, it's the self-talk in that moment that is either going to sabotage you and get you more riled up, or it's going to comfort you and calm you down. And the goal in that moment that you're taking that pause is that your self-talk is saying to you, take a breath, calm down, you're out of control, you're upset, you're going to lose it, whatever it is. And the moment that you have this, I call it participation, but observe. So you have a participating ego, basically. You have this other view of the situation. You're not just in it, you're aware of being in it. That's the observational eye. And that's the part of you that is supposed to say, take the break, take a moment, collect yourself. And if you're not present, if you don't feel your feet on the ground and you're not present during the conversation, but instead you're just there and you're just being reactive and not aware that I'm having an important conversation, or I'm starting to get upset, or something's shifted, if you're not aware of that shift that's happening within you, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And that's the purpose of that conversation, is to ground you and support you.
Yeah. Well, and I love you use the word reactive, because I agree. I think that's really the hub of it as well. And it takes a bit of training. It takes some self-reflection. If we haven't been taught a lot of these skills growing up, sadly, as you and I have chatted about, whether I think it should be mandatory education in elementary school, these valuable communication skills, but definitely retraining ourselves to get out of reactive mode and into a mode where we recognize that we have control over some of these decisions. And the other thing I just really want to put a pin in, because I think you said something that is really profoundly important and so often overlooked, and that's that getting curious piece, right? When in any conversation where it's got the potential to go sideways, or just generally just get curious, it allows you to get that perspective taking. We talk, whether it's the 6 and the 9, whether it's the Chris Rock situation, humor, looking at that intention versus impact. If you take the time to get curious and ask those questions, you're going to allow yourself the opportunity to get that better perspective and make better decisions.
You can also, one of my other big things is benefit of the doubt. You can also give the other person the benefit of the doubt that they didn't mean it the way that you interpreted it. And that's a simple one. And even if they did mean it that way, if you allow yourself the freedom to look at it, that maybe they didn't mean it to upset me as much, or to be a dig, or to hurt my feelings, that lightens it up for you for that moment. And the goal is not about them. In that moment, it's about you not being reactive, which, and I also want to add, everything we're talking about here, I do teach this in my course for exactly the reasons that we're talking about, because nobody teaches this stuff. Nobody teaches you how to communicate. I've been calling it the trifecta, because it's everything that you and I are talking about in this paragraph here. It's about increasing your self-awareness so that you can be present enough to have a good conversation and be aware of yourself, the other person, and the environment. And then how do you have the conversation? I teach those tools and the strategies for having, initiating, trusting, and all of dealing with conflicts, and then coping. The masterclass in the program is all about coping with stress, coping with overwhelm, or even with negative self-talk. So I address all of these things, because if you don't have coping skills, good self-awareness, and communication skills, you can't show up as a complete person and have a full conversation where you can hold your own and know you're not going to be reactive, and present yourself in a way that you can feel good about and whole.
Nice. And that benefit of the doubt is so important, as you talked about, and on both fronts, right? One, it allows you, as you say, to be able to, for yourself, giving that benefit of the doubt, because our reality is determined by the meaning we attach to things. So we get to choose whether we're going to take it as a slight, or whether we're going to give that benefit of the doubt. And it also allows you to show up with more grace for the vis-a-vis the other party. So if we shift from the sort of workplace scenario for a moment, what are some of the key problems that you find with communications with intimate partners? And again, I find that doesn't get talked about often, other than in sort of those sidebar, supermarket magazines, where you have all of these articles that give a lot of horrific advice sometimes. What do you find are the key problems in that all important communication with your intimate partner?
I think when you're talking about any personal relationship, usually the hesitancy around hurting someone's feelings. And so the conversation, again, might not happen, because they're so afraid that they are going to say something that is going to upset the person, and it's going to take a left turn and they won't know what to do, or that the other person will be so hurt and then they'll feel terrible that they've hurt their feelings. So either way, they're stymied. They can't get out of their own way because they're in their head so much, and they come to the conclusion that they're not going to say anything. That's the most common, that people shut down because they're so afraid of the reaction of the other person, because it's an intimate relationship and it's not worth it. It's not worth getting him or her upset. It's not worth hurting their feelings.
Yeah. Nice. And interestingly, as you're saying that, I was thinking maybe it's just where I grew up, but at the other end of the spectrum, you also have, I think, because absolutely really valuable input in those relationships where you're not wanting to rock the boat and you're wanting to be respectful and not hurt somebody, however well-intentioned, you end up in that avoidance mode. And at the other end of the spectrum, you can often see where people tend to be more reactive, actually give less pause, because at some level, maybe they see it as a safe space, or they're a little less careful in those intimate relationships than they would be in third party. What is your experience of that, Deborah?
So what I talk about in reference to those kinds of conflicts is usually one of those people is turned away. That's one of the things we talked about last time. So if I'm in a relationship with you and I have a green light to say whatever I want to say to you because I'm ticked, and I'm going to express myself and say it in any way that I want to, because I don't really care what you think. Right there, I'm turned away. I'm not being relational. I don't really care about your reaction or your feelings. I'm much more thinking about me, my feelings. This is like a solo experience. So that the difference is between what I described in the beginning. Ultimately, I am turned away if I don't have a conversation also. But having a conversation when you just let it rip is, even though it might feel good for the moment, usually it doesn't end well. And typically you're not thinking about being relational and the end goal that you want to accomplish. You are looking to win, to make your point, to let them have it. There is a goal. It's not a relational goal, though. So you're not going to accomplish something for the relationship, and you don't really care what the outcome is typically. In that moment, you're not thinking long-term or short-term.
Oh gosh, been there, but so on both ends of that equation, sadly. But I think so important that point you're making as well about that relationship outcome, for want of a better term. I think we all think about the substantive outcome, but so often we forget that in every discussion, in every negotiation, in every communication where you're looking to get some sort of give or take, there's the subject you're talking about, but also get really intentional about the relationship outcome, because what we say and how we say it has an impact on the relationship in addition to whatever it is that we're talking about. So important. And I'd love if you could speak to, I don't think we touched on this before, but what role or impact, if any, do you think the pandemic has or will play in communications, sort of either at this stage or going forward?
Do you mean personally or?
Both, actually, because I think we're seeing really profound shifts in how people are showing up or seeing themselves and their place in the world and in the workplace. I think we're really facing a pretty unprecedented economic shift in how businesses show up. So I'd love your feedback on both if you're open to that, Deborah.
There's a lot to say. I'll try to be concise.
Yeah, it's a bit of a loaded question. Sorry.
Let me think this through. I believe that for the most part, whether it's workplace or personally, people have taken stock of what's important to them.
Yeah.
That's the Great Resignation. Yeah. That's people holding their people close or closer. So I do think that the good that's come out of it is that we've realized that communication is much more important than people ever realized. They're finally catching up to me, I like to say. Of course, they're trying, because I've been talking about this for a long time. So it's nice to know that this is a welcomed conversation, to be honest. Before, it was definitely minimized. And companies are realizing that those that didn't recognize that, number one, it's not enough to say, okay, here you go, here's a computer, and you're going to work remotely, and we'll talk to you next Tuesday, and let us know how you're doing. Yeah. That when people were in the midst of this, if they didn't hear from their employer, if they didn't hear from their manager, and if someone didn't say more than, how are you? No, really, how are you? And try to connect with them as a human being, they didn't feel good about that connection anymore. They didn't feel cared for. And ultimately, whether at work or at home, we want to know we matter. Yes. We are human beings. We want to feel heard, and we want to know we matter. We don't have to be loved by our employer, or our manager or whomever. Yeah. But we do have to be acknowledged and recognized. Nobody wants to feel that they're an outcast, that they're not respected, or that they're not thought of. Yeah. And I think that the companies that function that way are realizing now that was not a really good look. And in relationships, when you are confined to a home with your partner, you learn that the way we're going to get along is to be respectful and to listen to each other. I was doing a podcast with someone early on who had a great sense of humor. And she literally said to me in the middle of the podcast, can you tell me what to say to my husband who's in the other room, also on a phone call, and he's talking so loud? Can you hear him? It's like that time. And he said, I'm recording a podcast. So everybody was having these relationships that were all, crossing over different lines. But I think the bottom line for everything that we're talking about is being treated with respect and with integrity, showing up. in an honest way and letting the other person know in a kind way that they matter, that you're interested. You may not know what to say, but just validating someone and asking questions makes someone feel heard.
Yeah. And these are such simple concepts, and yet we don't bring enough intention to it. So I thank you for sharing that. And it's fine. We are hearing so much about the Great Resignation, and I like to reframe that and keep calling it the Great Reset, because I think it is a real opportunity, as you say, for everybody to take stock and revision how you want to show up, who you want to be, and in your communications and
I
beyond.
agree.
So now, as you know, I believe all of life is a negotiation. So I'd love it. I see communication as a form of negotiation, but to the extent that you see a distinction, how do your communication methods help to make us more effective negotiators? And I believe they do, for sure.
I do too. I almost want to ask you why you think that they do.
Yeah. Oh,
I
I've had
turned the table on you.
yeah, no, and I love your model. I mean, I think it really epitomizes everything that I've been preaching for years as well, that showing up with that compassion, with intention about building rapport, bringing empathy to the table, right? Building trusting relationships. I mean, all of these are key elements to effective negotiation. And to me, and I'll let you speak to it yourself, but certainly I think you're the keys behind your relationship protocol, as well as the steps that you recommend, really follow what would be the key indicators of effective negotiation paths. So I'd love your perspective on that.
Well, I'm quoting you on everything you just said, by the way.
I'll send you the recording. You got it.
That's my little snippet now. I love hearing other people describe my work. When you're talking about it so much, you hear your own voice so often. So it's fun to turn the tables on you for a moment.
Yeah.
I believe that the two key elements of my model are so important for that connection. And in order to be respected in a negotiation, you have to show up committed to that interaction, to the organization, to whatever it is, the outcome that you are, that's not English, to whatever outcome you are seeking.
Yeah.
And then you need to shift your thinking to connect with the other person's experience. You are not one person in the room. You don't have to agree with them. You don't even have to like them, but you have to show up in a way that lets the other person know that you recognize them and that you can connect with them to the best of your ability. That's the minimum that you need to do, I think. So I think the two key elements are where everything starts for any interaction, organization, or intimate relationship, or friends even. You have to have them. And then the steps give you exactly what you just said, Cindy. They give you the opportunity to show up with intention. You can be persuasive if you want, but you're doing it in a respectful way. So again, you want to be heard. You're not looking to bowl somebody over, because then they're looking at you with the deer in the headlights. They feel like you're taking advantage of them and you've lost.
Yeah.
So showing up with strength and confidence and knowing how to communicate, when you have people there that have differing outcomes that they're seeking, differing agendas, you have to show up very clear-headed, very prepared, as you and I've talked a lot about, and knowing what your takeaways are, what works for you and what doesn't, and being a really good listener. But go back to what we said before. If I'm not present, if I don't know how to be present and also observe while I'm interacting, then I'm missing the cues and something's going to catch me off guard. But if I'm paying attention and I'm observing you while we're speaking and I'm aware of the environment and I notice now it's getting tense, I can think to myself, okay, what do I need to do? But if I'm not fully there, I will miss something and it'll be my error.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's it's funny that you touch on that, because it's the verbal and those nonverbals, which so often get overlooked.
Totally.
It's not just what people are saying, but watch their body language, watch those cues, tone of voice, pacing, all of those important factors. And I love that you always speak to that piece of listening, because we are not great in North America as listeners, right? We don't listen well. We wait for our turn to speak, and we consider ourselves, we pat ourselves on the back as if, we're
We
really
waited.
that we actually waited instead
Yay.
of cutting them off. So listening, definitely a key hallmark to making a great negotiator. What are some other key hallmarks or skills that you would say make for great negotiators or communicators?
I think taking that pause.
Yeah.
So that a lot of times we feel that we need to jump in and we need to respond. And I think it's nice in some ways to take that pause and let the person see that you're being thoughtful about what you're saying. There's intelligence that comes with silence. So this isn't about jumping back and forth and having a retort and saying the right thing right away,
Yeah.
but thinking through, how do I want to come across? So one is stopping and thinking, and then I threw that in there, but how do I want to come across?
Yeah.
So not only what am I saying, but and my message, but my method, how I'm saying it. If I'm aggressive,
Yeah.
if I have an edge, if I'm not thinking it through, your first reaction is how I made you feel.
Yeah.
Your second reaction is what I've said.
Yeah.
We are human beings. If I don't like the way you talk to me, then I'm a New Yorker.
Oh.
You know what I mean? If I don't like the way that you spoke to me,
Yeah.
I'm so not that person.
Yeah.
But if I don't like the way you spoke to me, if that hurt my feelings, or if you were being aggressive with me, my first reaction is, why are you doing that? Why is she speaking to me that way? I'm not thinking, that was a very interesting comment that Cindy made about, the
Yes.
price of whatever.
Yeah.
I don't care what you just said. I care how you spoke to me, how you related to me. So being a good negotiator means taking that pause, thinking it through, but thinking, how do I want to say what I want to say? Not just the words, but my approach is super important.
Yeah. Yeah. In some ways more important, really. What is it they say? People don't
Totally.
remember what you said, but they'll remember how you made them feel.
And
And
it's true.
yeah, and we often don't even get to the second piece. I think sometimes if you speak to somebody in a way where they feel disrespected or not seen or not heard, it doesn't matter what you say because they're not hearing it. It is
Exactly.
gone. You don't even actually get to that second stage of the equation. So important. And that immediacy that you touched on, I want to really put a pin in that for our listeners as well, because we do our media, our entertainment, everything we're conditioned to see as being a so-called definition of successful negotiator. It's the person who's talking the most, the person who's dominating the conversation. And in fact, the opposite is true. It's the thoughtful person who can take the time, who can get curious, as you said, and don't feel like you need to have that really quick, snappy comeback, but take the time to give the position the consideration that it deserves. It'll definitely go a lot further in building trust. I love that. And what do you think are some of the key reasons that negotiations and or communications fail generally?
Well, the opposite of everything we've said, certainly. You set me up for that too.
Yeah.
But in truth, right? If I don't listen to you and I go in with my own agenda and I'm talking and I'm not aware of anybody else in the room, I'm assuming there's perhaps more than one person in the room,
Yeah.
but I go in with my head,
Yeah.
or I'm unprepared,
Yeah.
or I'm intimidated. My reaction to you, if I'm ill prepared or not confident in the material that I'm presenting, that I'm trying to negotiate about, or whatever's taking place, if I don't know you, if I haven't done my research, I go in a deficit.
Yeah.
So it really is about preparing and knowing the material that you're talking about and knowing what the takeaways that you want the person to have, what the deal breakers are for you, whether they're emotional deal breakers, things that I take it to another level, by the way, when I do prep with people for any important conversation. It's not only how do I want to come across, it's what aspects of this conversation might also make me lose my mind.
Yeah.
So what might trigger me and make me have an emotional reaction, because they're going to speak to me a certain way. They're going to talk about a topic that makes me super upset or super emotional. If I know that hot button issue is coming up, I need to really feel my feet on the floor. I need to sit up straight. I need to make choices about how I'm going to respond, rather than feel out of control or feel vulnerable or feel almost childlike.
Yeah.
So we can turn into a whole other human being when we are in heated negotiations around something that's important to us, that brings us to an emotional level that we're ill prepared to be at in that moment. So if you can go in there knowing and really thinking it through, this is emotional. I've done this with people that go into divorce proceedings. I've done this with business partners who are about to sit down, and I've talked to both partners.
Yeah.
What's the deal breaker for you emotionally?
Yeah.
Well, she speaks to me a certain way and I see red. Okay, well, she might do that. So what can you do instead of seeing red? So it's really preparation, poor preparation. That's a big problem, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I'm smiling just because I so love your approach. I mean, and I'm biased because it's so in alignment with all of my beliefs about communication and negotiation. And I'm so glad you touched on that as an element of preparation. I was going to ask you about preparation and you just addressed it. I think it is so often undervalued, and it is one of the most important steps of any effective communication or negotiation. And I particularly love that you talk about preparing yourself, because we do not do that enough. I have two quick models. One I call the no fear model, and it's go through your fear, ego, attachment, and reactivity. What are the fears that are likely to show up for me, when I'm going into this discussion? What are my triggers? How does ego show up for me, and how can I make sure that doesn't happen? What are the things I tend to get most attached to, and what are the things that make me reactive, right? That FEAR.
Okay.
And I also do a 5W, and the first one is exactly what you said. Who do I want to show up as? Pick those 3 words so I can ground myself. If I get off track and something happens unexpectedly to trigger me, I can take that breath and reground myself. And who are they expecting me to show up as? So important. That such a great point you touched on, that preparation, and not just for your substantive outcomes, but just want to put in a pin there for everybody about Debra's point. Prepare yourself for your negotiations and communications. So important. I
Yeah.
love that.
And I'll add even another piece, because there's another layer. Know yourself.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
our job to know ourselves. And you want to negotiate, and you want to be a good negotiator, you want to show up and be effective, you
Yeah.
better know yourself. You better know what your hot buttons are and
Yeah.
what's going to get to you. Because if not, you're going to get caught off guard. And none of us function well. You can prepare for almost every condition, but you cannot prepare for being caught off guard.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when we are caught off guard, and we all do it. I mean, things happen. You have to even know to take the breath then. So don't react. Don't say anything. Think about it.
I love that. And when you say know yourself, which I think is great advice, nice and concise, that includes know your learning style. For example, if you're, whether in a business setting or personal, if you've got a partner, a business partner or personal partner who's spewing data at you and you're not an auditory learner, it's okay to say, hey, you know what? I'd really love to see this in writing. Can you get me a proposal to review or whatever, right? And, knowing those all important learning styles and those triggers, as you say, really a game changer. And you've talked a couple of times about those triggers and reactivity. And again, such an important point. What role does emotion play in our communications and negotiations?
It depends on who you're talking to and what you're talking about. But emotions are what we're passionate about, what drive us. And hopefully, for the most part, when you're trying to come across intelligently, you can feel the emotions and express the emotions through your words versus through your actions. Because if I'm angry at you, I can say to you, I am really upset.
Yeah.
It super bothers me. Maybe I don't talk like that, but really bothers me that you did X, Y, and Z, versus just screaming at you. So keeping your emotions, if they're heightened, in check is very important. And knowing that you have them, knowing that you're getting upset. I teach something called checking in. It's a simple exercise, but it's checking in with yourself. How am I doing? How am I feeling? And you do that every day. More than once a day. And so you start to see how you're affected by different people and different things and different circumstances. And then you get to say to yourself, similar to what we're talking about, what do I need to do about it? That's how you expand your self-awareness, you grow your emotional intelligence, so that when you're sitting somewhere having a conversation that's important and something happens, you notice that shift within yourself, because you know yourself, you know your internal temperature, so to speak, so you can catch it quicker.
Yeah. Nice. Well, and that self-awareness, but it serves you across the board in all aspects of your life. I think that's such great advice. And it's funny when you're talking about that, because not that long ago, we didn't hear about emotion a lot. Like if you've talked about like any of the academics who talked about negotiations or even communication styles, it was more the tactics, the strategies, the how to. Emotion didn't get talked to until relatively recent history. And now most of the advice is don't be emotional, don't be emotional. And I like to draw that distinction. I think that's what you've touched on. There's a difference between being emotional, like letting yourself get angry or reactive, versus bringing emotion, like recognizing that emotion. Bring the deep emotion of your deep why, your motivator, for example.
That's right.
That can be
That's
super
your why.
effective. Yeah. Yeah.
Half the time, that's why you're in the room, because something really matters to you and it hurts you. It's heartbreaking. I've sat with companies that were getting dissolved because people could not sit in a room together.
Yeah.
And they were so passionate about how they felt. But the thing that got them in the same room is that the ultimate outcome mattered to both of them. So
Yeah.
that became how they joined forces together.
Yeah.
But to figure out, how can I join forces with the other person if that should be the ultimate outcome for the sake of the bigger picture? It's
Yeah.
going and knowing what the bigger picture is, I think, most
Yeah.
of the time.
Yeah, nice. And what are your thoughts, just as we're saying, on vulnerability? I mean, we hear Brene Brown speak about it a lot now. A decade or so ago, I mean, my gosh, it was like taboo. And I know growing up, it was like, never show weakness, never show emotion, never show whereas now vulnerability seems to be very, in vogue. I'd be interested in your perspective about the role of vulnerability in communications.
I think it's important to be vulnerable. Look, it depends on the conversation. If it's with someone in a position of authority and you feel it's going to be seen as a weakness, I might keep it in check. But in general, when we allow ourselves to be a little bit more open, it makes us feel closer to the person who's being vulnerable, and being vulnerable ourselves allows us to get closer to other people. I can tell you a quick story. I was working with a company where I recommended that the CEO, in his next address to all of the employees, that he talk about his own vulnerability, about disappointment in himself and the decisions that he made that he knew were not good, that that impacted them, because he was horrified, but would never have said anything. And I talked him through it, and he gave the most beautiful talk.
Yeah.
And people came up to him afterwards and said they never felt the way that they did about working at the company, because he opened up a door that had been slammed shut, and they never felt they could talk to him about things. And the fact that he opened that door led to so many wonderful opportunities for him as a leader, and for the people that worked for him to feel closer to him. They felt his commitment, and he felt their commitment, just from being a little bit more vulnerable. So it can have a wonderful outcome.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a beautiful story. And I think it's beautiful advice, because, when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, it builds that trust. And that's the cornerstone of effective communication, and the cornerstone of, any effective negotiation. Ability to persuade is allowing that authenticity as well, which, not trying to pretend to be somebody else or show up as somebody that you think is the expected version, but being truly authentic in yourself and allowing that vulnerability. Because when we see that in other people, it draws us closer to them, as you say, and that builds that bridge for the trust that we need. So I love that. So important. Yeah. And what is something, Deborah, that you know now that you wish you'd known sooner in life?
Ooh, goodness.
Sorry.
There's a list. I think that I was always afraid of being in business for myself, because I thought that sales was something that was a four-letter word.
Yes.
And you're with me on that?
Totally.
Can I get an amen?
Yeah.
But what I've learned is I've really been able to build my business the way that I needed to do it, and to do it in the pace that I needed to do it, to get over my own fears, my own insecurities, because I'm a very private person. I did not want to be in the public eye at all. I was very happy being behind the scenes. And then the mission of the purpose of why I'm out in the world talking about communication is much bigger than my fears. And learning that, and then taking that and applying it to, I wake up every day and I say, how can I be of service, and how can I serve deeper? Now, that may be because my background is originally as a social worker, and I tend to think in those terms, but not to save the world or change the world. Yeah, to change the world in many ways, but really, how can I be of service? And I think when I look at connecting with people, I don't see it as sales anymore. I really see it as, I know that what I am offering is of value, and it can change someone's life. And it can be transformational if they follow these, the 8 lessons in the program that I'm offering now. And so when I take that step back, I don't feel the fear that I used to feel. I'm much more coming from a place of strength. And when we come from a place of strength, it's very powerful.
Yeah. That's so beautiful, and it totally resonate with me. And I imagine for many of our listeners out there as well, like I definitely was resistant. And having practiced law for 30 years, I mean, I didn't have to go sell myself. It was just sort of word of mouth and it came. And when I started
Mm.
Women on Purpose and when I started with the art of feminine negotiation, my gosh, I was shocked at how many internal blocks I had for exactly the reasons that you said. I saw that sales as kind of a dirty word and I felt like it was an imposition. It kind of made me cringe until recognizing service. And I also want to put a pin in what you said, Deborah, because I think it is such a beautiful way to show up for life, not just getting over our own fears or resistance about what we're offering, but just
Yes.
coming from a place of service rather than that place of ego. Recognizing that shift, that's a game changer in life generally for communications, for negotiations, and just for
Mm.
improved quality of life. So I
Totally.
love that message. I think that's beautiful. And just flipping back for a second, when you talked about knowing yourself, how important do you think it is to know, like it, particularly in our personal relationships, our love languages, for example?
I don't focus as much on love languages. I think what's the term love languages, but I do think it's important to know what feels good to you and what doesn't. It feels good when I'm having a conversation with my husband and we're interacting with each other. It doesn't feel good when I feel like I'm being ignored, that type of a thing. I think if you know yourself well enough and you show up as a whole person, a confident person, you get the vibe, what works for you and what doesn't. And then you can communicate.
Yeah.
I like when we have these kind of conversations. I like when we do these kind of activities. I like when this happens or this doesn't happen or that we parent together. I like when you support me. Whatever it is, you can't know those things unless you have a sense of who you are and how you function in the world
Yeah.
and how you're affected by things. Once you know that, then you can communicate those kinds of things and you can communicate your love language.
Yeah.
That I need you to compliment me. I need you to talk to me, all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But if you don't know yourself, you don't know any of those kinds of things. That's why I'm always like back at the primitive level, very, very
Yeah.
organic.
Oh, well, so powerful though, that and again, such a simple concept, but my gosh, we do not often communicate what we like. And the way that you just said that so calmly, so matter of factly, and I think we miss that so often. And dare I say, I think as women in particular in our intimate relationships, we've got a little bit of baggage often about assuming that if they love me enough, they will just know, right? and we attach all of these meanings to things, the most ridiculous things, like, oh, they didn't know what gift to buy me. They don't care about me. How does he not know that I like raspberry jam more than strawberry jam? Like, just communicate your wants, your needs, your desires. It can be such a shift in your relationships. I'd love your thoughts on that.
Well, I think you have to really take a deep breath and think of what's important to you. In the scheme of things, maybe he isn't remembering which jam you like, but is he making an effort in other areas that are more important to you?
Absolutely.
Is he showing up differently? If in every area of your life you feel disregarded
Yeah.
with this person, that's a different conversation. But there's a story I love to tell of this couple I was working with years ago. They were sitting in front of me and he said, I've been really trying hard. And she said, well, you brought home the wrong apples. This is a true story. He said, what do you mean? And she said, you brought home the wrong apples. There's only one kind of apple that I can eat. And you brought home whatever it was, Macintosh, and I can only eat Granny Smith.
Yeah.
Now, this man did a complete turnaround from how he used to function because he wanted her to know that she was important to him. And he went to the store to get food for her.
Yeah.
He happened to get everything else right, but he got the wrong apples.
Yeah.
Her conversation centered around what he didn't do.
Yeah.
And what she started to realize is her focus was much more on what he wasn't doing than what he was doing. Now, that's her role to figure out, but it's also her role to understand that that impacts him, that it doesn't make him want to make the effort. And then when he said, well, that doesn't make me want to go to the store for you. I'm trying to do a nice gesture. And she thought that was awful. And so my job was to translate that. I don't feel the same way, but I do think that, we can get we're single-minded. We're not seeing anything outside of that. And that's when you have to stop and really look, am I being kind? Am I being fair? And is this really important in the scheme of things? Or am I a little overreactive because I'm sensitive to it? And if I am, then why? Is there a history here that this person can be inconsiderate or not thoughtful in terms of how he or she, how they function? And so I think it's important to look at your reaction in the scheme of things.
Yeah.
Is it something you need to think about and change because it's not working for your relationship or yourself? Or is it something you need to communicate about?
Yeah. Wow. And so many layers to that, Deborah. I just love that because I mean, this idea about focus and law of attraction, right? Because what we focus on, if our focus is always on the negative, even when somebody's making the effort and you're not giving any positive reinforcement, you're going to get more of what, your attention is going to be drawn more to the negative, and they
That's
might be
right.
doing 9 out of 10 things correct. But if your focus is always on the one, you're going to continue to attract because, our reality is determined by the meaning we attach to things. So such a powerful piece of advice there about ourself, knowing ourself and how we show up and interact. I love that.
And look at how the other person is reacting to you.
Of course.
Listen to them. When they say to you, you're always negative, you're always picking on me. Why don't you up? Don't have your retort of, I do not, no, I don't, you're wrong.
Yes.
Because at some point you have to stop, and say, this person is important to me and how they feel has to matter to me, even if I don't agree with them.
Yeah. And I would extend that as well. I think that is such gorgeous advice you're given, both personally and professionally in the workplace as
100%.
well. I see that over and over again where people are focusing on just the negative feedback and not seeing even in performance evaluations, recognizing the gift of the feedback you're getting as opposed to getting in a defensive position and not getting any of the benefit of it. So great advice. And again, I am so glad we booked a second. I cannot believe how quickly our time goes together. And as always, just such great, valuable input. And as you know, I always like to end by asking what's one of the greatest mindset shifts you've had? I know you already shared one last week, but any other mindset shifts that you'd like to share with us that you think might be valuable, maybe to any of our listeners out there?
Well, I think what we were just talking about is important. Step 3 of the relationship protocol is own your part. And if you're in a personal relationship, you own your part because that person matters to you and how they feel should matter to you. And if it's a business relationship, you own your part because if you don't take accountability and ownership, the other person is not going to feel that you're recognizing that you've made a mistake or wrongdoing. So I think being able to be humble enough to take a step back, that we're not always going to be right, and that sometimes how the other person is reacting to us or how they feel needs to matter to us enough that we can step up and show up a little bit differently.
Nice. You cannot go wrong with that advice. Well, as always, Debra, it was so great to have you here. Thank you for sharing your time. Thank you for sharing your expertise. Thank you for the work that you do, helping people be better versions of themselves. So thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners out there, make sure to learn more about Debra as well. You can check her out on Instagram at The Relationship Protocol. Check out her website. We'll make sure to have all of that in the show notes for you as well. And I'm sure you all just got loads of value from this episode. As I say, I knew I had to have Debra back because we had sort of been scratching the surface and there's just so much gorgeous insight there that I wanted to make sure you got to dig a little deeper with her. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already done that, and share this with anyone else that you think could get value from the message. And in particular, this episode, as well as last week's episode, I invite you to make sure to share that with everybody that you care about in your life, because communication is at the crux of how we show up and we get what we get. So make sure to be sharing this message far and wide, because everybody could benefit from this approach. And that is a wrap for this episode. So until next time, go forth and negotiate your best life on your terms so you can stop missing out and start getting more of what you want and deserve from the boardroom to the bedroom. Until next time, take care.